Kurland's on the air. It's Yetta Kurland live. Yetta Kurland, listening.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first 2013 edition of Yetta Kurland Live. I am your host, Yetta Kurland. Tonight, we'll kick off our new year with Sharon Stapel of the Anti-Violence Project, as well as Susanna, Saul, and Carmen of inMotion, Inc. on the Violence Against Women Act. We'll also be talking with Abate on Grindr and public health, and Morgan Pehme on the biggest political stories of 2012 and what to expect in 2013. I first want to thank our media partners, Go Magazine, Labor Press, the Soho Journal, Westview News, City and State New York, and the New Civil Rights Movement for helping make this show happen, as well as our community sponsors, the Ritz and Whole Earth Bakery. You can pick up a copy of the Westview News at 69 Charles Street. Check out Go Magazine at your local newsstand or at gomag.com. City and State New York is online at cityandstateny.com. The Soho Journal at sohojournal.com. The New Civil Rights Movement at thenewcivilrightsmovement.com. And the Labor Press is at laborpress.org. Also, you can listen to us live stream at WWRL1600.com. And please join us on Facebook at Yetta Kurland Live, on Twitter at Yetta Kurland, and check us out on Huffington Post at huffingtonpost.com/Yetta. This week in the news, the United States Congress just barely managed to avoid falling off the fiscal cliff, but they unfortunately failed to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and only approved part of the vital aid needed for Sandy victims of New York or New Jersey after large outcry. Speaking of Sandy, the National Climatic Data Center came out with their annual report this week. 2012, it turns out, is the hottest year in American history. Indeed, all 10 of the hottest years have occurred since 1998. 2012 was also the second worst year ever on a measure called the Climate Extremes Index, which measures weather disasters. So much for the idea that climate change is a myth. On the other hand, this week saw the swearing in of the America's first ever openly LGBT senator, that is Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, and it appears as though she may shortly be joined by Barney Frank in Massachusetts. We'll be talking about the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, public health, politics, sex, and more right here on Yetta Kurland Live with Sharon Stapel, Susanna, Saul, Carmen, Abate, Morgan Pehme, and you, the listeners. Call in with questions or comments. The number to do so is 212-868-0975. Again, that number, 212-868-0975. Let's go to our first guests here with us in studio. All of them have been here on Yetta Kurland Live before. And first, as a way of background, last week the United States Congress allowed the 18-year-old Violence Against Women Act to expire. Our guests work on the front lines of stopping violence against women in different capacities. We're delighted to have them here to discuss this important issue. First, we have Sharon Stapel. She is the executive director of the New York City Anti-Violence Project. AVP empowers lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV-affected communities and allies to end all forms of violence through organizing and education and support survivors through counseling and advocacy. Sharon, thanks for coming on Yetta Kurland Live tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Next we have Susanna Saul and Carmen Ray. They are both attorneys at inMotion, Inc., which is a non-profit which provides legal services to women in New York City designed to address the unique needs of women who suffer from abuse. They represent many women impacted by the Violence Against Women Act, and I'm glad it brings them to the show again tonight. Guys, thanks for coming back on to Yetta Kurland Live.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for having us.
Great. So again, if you guys have questions out there in the listening audience, 212-868-0975, 212-868-0975. And I know there's a lot being talked about this, and there's a lot of opinions that are going on. I know this is not the final point here, but it is a pretty shocking event. In fact, I was speaking to Sharon off air before we came on, saying that the last time you were here, we were talking about the Vow Act, and I kind of was cavalierly saying, it's going to be fine, as if I knew more about than the experts. Maybe you could start by, just for our listeners who maybe have heard something but aren't sure exactly what's going on, what happened, and maybe give us just a basic outline of where we are with this.
Absolutely. The Violence Against Women Act is the country's response to domestic and sexual violence, right? So it's the act that started in 1994. It was passed into law and really created a culture in this country where we moved domestic and sexual violence out of the sort of private realm into the social realm, where we saw it as a health issue, as a societal issue. And it has been a law that has been reauthorized a number of times in a bipartisan way, overwhelmingly bipartisan. And in this past few years, with the Congress that we have right now, it was up for reauthorization in 2012, introduced in the Senate, and eventually a separate bill was introduced into the House, neither of which were conferenced or reconciled in a way that passed the final law at the end of 2012. That doesn't mean that we can't make any more progress. We're already working on the reintroduction in the 113th Congress, but what it means is, perhaps not surprisingly, in the 112th Congress, which did less work than any other Congress since the 1940s, this is one of the pieces of legislation that also did not get passed.
And when you say less work, obviously there's a little bit of bickering between the Democrats and Republicans, not for want of efforts, but and also, does it possibly mean an interruption of these services until stuff can be worked out?
I mean, I think it's a pretty complicated question. The reality is VAWA, the 2005 VAWA expired in January of 2012, not in 2013. So all of this sort of VAWA didn't get passed in 2013 and now is dead is not actually the case. VAWA didn't pass didn't get reauthorized in 2011 and expired in 2012. Wow. But there are, and without going into so much detail that people fall asleep, there are different parts of VAWA. So there are significant sections of VAWA that never actually expire. It's really the programs that need to be reauthorized, and when the programs are reauthorized, the appropriations or the money to fund those programs also need to be reauthorized.
Because there's a wide breadth of services that VAWA offers. Right? And to maybe Susanna and Carmen, you guys are kind of on the ground working real time with stuff, as is AVP as well. What does this mean, and has this had any impact in terms of your constituency and who you serve?
Well, we have gotten a lot of questions lately from the lawyers that represent our clients, panicking, saying, what does this mean for our clients? Do they still have the same rights and remedies that we're applying for? People who have petitions pending, people who are in the process of preparing petitions, who haven't done it yet. And our answer is no. In terms of the law is the law. The Congress would have to actually actively repeal the law for there to be any interruption in the rights that are currently on the books.
So this is reassuring, because one of that I know of, the most important provisions that VAWA allows is for women who experience violence are able to seek asylum under VAWA. Is that correct? And is that still something that's available to women?
VAWA has created 3 different types of immigration relief available to non-citizen victims of domestic violence and other types of domestic violence-related harm. Those have not changed. Those remain on the books. What is problematic and really demoralizing is that all the improvements to the laws that we have asked for and been working for the last 5 years have been really not.
So what are some of those improvements?
I mean, and just to be clear, and I think I said this the last time that I was on your show, but I think it's important to understand that each time VAWA is reauthorized, it's done with the input of advocates on the ground in the field. And so in this case, there was a 2-year study that resulted in multiple reports about what needed to improve to help survivors of violence in the United States. And There are many, many, many things, but the three things that I think people are most familiar with are the explicit inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity protections for LGBT survivors, some improvements to already existing immigration relief that Carmen and Susanna are talking about, and a very modest proposal around tribal jurisdiction of misdemeanor offenses for domestic and sexual violence that would allow tribal courts to adjudicate instead of having to have those cases go to federal court.
And why is that so important?
Part of it is because the feds don't always prosecute these cases when people want them to. And part of it is because even if the feds do prosecute, people live in such rural areas that it's impossible for them to participate in the case if the federal courts are, hundreds of miles away, which they often are. But part of it is if we live in a country where non-tribal people can go onto tribal land and assault or victimize tribal people, and there is no remedy within that community to be able to address it. What we're saying basically is we don't care as much about tribal victims as we do other victims, right? And that's just that's an impossible, untenable position to take in this country in 2013 about any survivor of violence.
So you said a couple of interesting things, making sure that there are other aspects of the bill that are included, that there are certain laws in place, thankfully, to calm any concern in terms of those laws. They would have to be repealed first. Right. But what I'm hearing Sharon say, and tell me if this is correct, is that what we're concerned about, if there's not some sort of immediate remedy, is that a lot of the funding will be cut out, or that there won't be resources financially to do some of the stuff programmatically.
Sharon is more knowledgeable about the funding issues than we are because we're attorneys and she's an executive director, so this is her kind of daily concern.
She may be an attorney also. Are you?
She's also an attorney.
Not practicing anymore.
Well, I practice, I just haven't gotten it right. What do we know as attorneys? So is that the big...
The appropriations are different. So the appropriations of the money that fund the program, they are different than the law, than the Violence Against Women Act, but connected, obviously. There is a continuing resolution for appropriations right now that will go through March 27th, and there may well be another continuing resolution after that. But the critical thing here is that programs on the ground, programs like inMotion, programs like AVP that are funded with this money cannot have a sort of existence where every 3 months they're wondering whether there's going to be funding available, right? Because you can't do the kind of intervention, crisis intervention and safety planning and long-term work that you need to do with survivors to get them from sort of violence to safety under those circumstances.
Right.
And we've definitely been seeing in New York organizations really taking the potential lack of funding into account when determining growth. How do you move? How do you give people jobs? How do you hire or fire? We don't know.
Or does it also impact the breadth of service that you are able to offer to a specific constituent because you're worried about funding to kind of go around for everyone?
Kind of the lack of funding is a constant issue in this area, in the service area. But yes, I mean, people need to make plans, year-long plans about how you're going to hire and fire, and we don't know where funding is coming from or whether we are getting funding.
And the other uncertainty has to do with the law side of it. And the two versions that have been introduced in Congress, the Senate version and the House version.
Right.
And the Senate version, which does have some additional protections to add on to the existing law that really does protect many, many victims. And then there's the House version, which proposes to really gut a lot of the protections, the very, very vital protections for victims in our communities.
Which date back to 1994.
Right. Well, this makes a lot of sense. So the shock and fear that maybe you're hearing or questions you're hearing from attorneys who are calling in, it's not that level of concern, but the concern more is there's this overarching funding issue, but there's also this thing of now what version it's going to be, and you guys are kind of under the gun because you have only so long, I imagine. If Sharon's saying this was actually not funded as early back as 2011, how long do folks have until funding runs out or to get it together?
It's the law itself that expired in in January of 2012 as opposed to January 2013, which is it's a much sexier story, but it's not actually factually true. So the law itself and the way that programs are sort of structured expired a year ago, but still continue because they're still being funded, right? So it's just, in that sense, what we haven't done is made the improvements that thousands and thousands and thousands of advocates, law enforcement, all the folks who deal with VAWA on a day-to-day basis know that we need in order to really help survivors. The funding itself, technically the continuing resolution is still current through the end of March. It is very likely that there will be another continuing resolution. But again, it's the tentativeness that is really untenable.
Yeah. And when you say, you know, these special improvements, I mean, you're actually talking about entire communities, right? At AVB,
Absolutely.
you're dealing with LGBTQ folks. How does that impact those communities?
Well, I mean, right now we receive VAWA funding. VAWA is funding is available to LGBT programs. The problem with not having the language explicitly in the bill isn't that we wouldn't be eligible for the programs, because we are, and there is a lot of administrative sort of documentation about that. But the problem is, without putting us directly in the bill, we're not acknowledging that this, A, we exist, B, that we face this problem, and C, that there are specific remedies that you have to look at when you're looking at working with LGBTQ survivors, right? And similar to, I think, what probably Carmen and Susanna will talk about working with immigrants, there are obstacles in addition to the violence that people face because of certain parts of their identity. And there is not a one-size-fits-all option. So going to your sort of mainstream domestic violence program may not actually resolve the problem. You may need someone with specific expertise in LGBT issues, in immigration issues. And the Violence Against Women Act, by including that acknowledgement, including that understanding that that's what advocates are saying is needed on the ground, allows for those programs to develop and to really be useful to survivors of violence.
You're listening to Sharon Stapel of the Anti-Violence Project and Susanna Saul and Carmen Ray of inMotion Inc. on Yetta Kurland Live, WWRL 1600. Call in with questions or comments. We're talking about the Violence Against Women Act here on WWRL. We're going to go to our first caller. Let's go to Arthur from Manhattan. Arthur, welcome to Yetta Kurland Live. You're on the air.
Yes, good evening, ladies. I was listening to you mention the fact that funding is a problem. Now, that made me want to pose the question, if you're getting funding from organizations that you might have to protest against, doesn't that create a problem?
Interesting question. You mean organizations that you're protesting, meaning, I'm not sure, the government, do you mean? Because this would be funding, if I'm not mistaken, this is funding from the government.
So what I'm saying is it might be an attorney general you might have to go against one day or something.
Well,
and wouldn't that hinder your ability to be able to take a strong stand simply because you're afraid your funds might get cut off? Or are you particular about where you get your funding? And I have one other question after that.
Okay.
Can I address that, Arthur? So, Arthur, Susanna and I, and the immigration attorney, our opponent is always the government of the United States, and it's quite often that, you know, we're in court and the court has paid through VAWA funding for my salary. It pays the judge's salary through the Department of Justice, and it pays the prosecutor's salary through the Department of Homeland Security. So, and it does not in any way affect how well and to what degree we defend our clients. You know, we understand the government, we believe, has a duty to represent its people and to do what's best for the people, and we are arguing that this is what is best for our clients.
Okay, now, but the point is that if you had to go up, say, in the Kennedy rape case, it would be very difficult for you to take a real, you know, like say he raped him. You know, do you remember the Kennedy rape case?
Yes, not at all. It would not.
Okay, now
not
my
at
next
all.
question is, too, we've all had some experience if we lived on this earth sometime. So is it fair that the prosecution and the prosecutors and the journalists bring up a woman's past history, and therefore it besmirches her image, where when she walks into court, she pretty much is embarrassed.
It's a well-made point. He's talking about the rape shield laws. Arthur,
Right.
thank you. Does that come up in your practice, and do you find having to deal with that an issue?
No, we find, I mean, in immigration proceedings at least, we find that that knowing our client's history really makes the prosecutor and the judge much more understanding of her situation and her needs. So we have ourselves not encountered that.
Okay. Great. Let's go to our next caller. We have Kim from the Upper East Side. Kim, welcome to Yetta Kurland Live. You're on the air.
Hi. I was just wondering, I know that the Violence Against Women Act is a federal law, I guess. I was wondering if individual states, like here in New York State, if we had our own version of this, so that even though the federal law isn't in place, that people in different states can be protected.
Right. Great question.
I think that's a really excellent question, Kim, and the answer is no. However, the Violence Against Women Act allows for what, and again, it gets sort of technical, but allows for what they call stop funding, which is administered by state administrators. So the money passes through. And that's really what the states are using to support many of these programs. There is other non-VAWA-related funding for domestic and sexual violence work, so this isn't the only source of funding, but certainly it's one of the biggest sources of funding.
What are some other sources of funding besides VAWA?
I mean, for government funding, for example, I mean, we get funded by the Department of Health to do work. So there's sort of lots of different places that we also get funded by another program in the Department of Justice called the Office for Victims of Crime, which does sort of also the same thing. But, you know, the reality is VAWA is and has been a lifeline for many domestic and sexual violence programs to be able to do the kind of work that they have figured out is what survivors need. And so the end of VAWA is unthinkable, I think, for most of us who do this work. And I personally don't believe it will happen. I do think, however, we are working with a Congress that has an assessment of values or principles that is right now trumping the actual needs of survivors. And that is, we cannot continue in a country where we have a Congress who wants to fight amongst themselves rather than actually looking at what survivors need. And frankly, VAWA is not the only legislation that is subject to this fight.
It's true. In fact, we introduced the fact that Sandy relief even took a couple of passes to get.
Can I just say one more thing about, just to address Kim's question? Kim, the VAWA has to address certain issues because the federal government has jurisdiction over certain things, and the state absolutely doesn't have the authority, the power to create legislation on certain topics, including immigration and the tribal stuff, the jurisdiction. So there are things that the states can do, and New York has done a lot, but we're limited. On the state level, we're limited, and the federal government really needs to step up and make these protections a reality.
That's a really good point.
And just to piggyback on what Sharon was saying, was that one of the things that I think surprises all of us that are doing this work every day is that it's not only advocates and victims and survivors who are calling for this legislation, but law enforcement is very clear in saying that they need VAWA in order to do their job well. Protections for stalking victims are really important. Protections for immigrant victims of crime are important. They do not feel that they can do their job to the best of their ability. And it's surprising to us that Congress seems to be ignoring their law enforcement's own statements on the issue.
Yeah, well, let's address that. And I think to circle back on what one of our Arthur earlier was saying, you know, I mean, there is a sensitivity to this stuff, right? And I think the backdrop of what we've seen with Congress, with the war on women, Carolyn Maloney walking out on a panel of people talking about reproductive rights that forgot to include even one woman. So, I mean, this backdrop, is that kind of what's happening in Congress? And then, you know, thinking forward, I think the encouraging words are that what Sharon's saying is that, you know, we're cautiously optimistic that something will happen. But, I mean, is that a fear? Is that a concern, thinking about how this is going to happen? And is the changes in Congress, the new women coming into Congress, are you guys hopeful that there will be at least a little bit different climate? It's the lame duck session for Barack Obama. Is there hope that it'll be a little bit different? Susanna, shaking your head.
Yeah. I'm trying to vigorously shake my head because I'm trying to rally optimism. And I do think so. I mean, I've definitely read, some articles saying that there are members of the House who have said that they would support the Senate version of the bill and who had voted no on it previously.
Yeah.
President Obama issued an executive order over the summer about calling for strong reaction to violence against women, and the momentum from the election I think is carrying a lot of weight, and so I am hopeful, but cautiously, as you say.
Well, it's great all the work that you guys are doing and bringing attention to this matter. It's really important, and I think when it's kind of this insidious attack where it's not like, oh my God, up in arms, VAWA is gone, but it's also like a slow erosion of some of the resources in it. I just want to squeeze in one more caller, but then I actually want to get, before we end our session, I want to actually talk a little bit about what you guys do, if there are listeners out there who maybe need some of the services, and let's plug that a little bit. We're going to go to Ed from the Upper West Side. Ed, you're on the air. Welcome to Yetta Kurland Live.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
When I was in the legislature, I did some research on some rape bills that I and a few other people were working on. And in studying New York State and the history of rape in New York State, came across the startling fact that in upstate counties there were 0 rapes committed officially.
Officially.
Zero rapes.
Was that before 1976, actually? Because, yeah.
And that's because, I'm guessing, that was because when a woman said that she made a complaint that she was raped, they said, well, where were you? Well, I was in Joe's bar. Oh, well.
Right.
That's not rape. That kind of attitude toward women who might not necessarily be a Doris Day type character, but nevertheless cannot be raped. You're not allowed to rape someone like that and get away with it.
Right.
And yet, in upstate New York, that's exactly what happened.
Well, thank you for that comment. It's appreciated. And also, obviously, the 1976 reference is that before 1976, rape did not exist in married couples.
Just to comment, VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, is violence against all people. It's called Violence Against Women.
Thank you, Carmen.
But it is, if you rape a man, you can also be, get protection under VAWA.
Right. Yeah. Do you find, though, that some of the issues are difficult to explain, or that, and maybe this is a good segue into some of the services that you provide? I introduced you as saying that most of your clients are women, but do you also give services to men who are
We only represent women. inMotion only represents women, but we represent women in same-sex relationships.
Right.
And
I imagine that in AVP you are often having to kind of educate people on the idea that that rape is an act of violence, and that it manifests with women and with men, or both.
Yeah, and one of the great things that the Violence Against Women Act did is bring this issue into the public consciousness. One of the harder things for LGBT folks is it made violence against women synonymous with domestic violence and sexual violence.
Right.
So lots and lots of people get excluded when we use that language as code, which is why I'm so happy Carmen made that clear. But yeah, so, and I think that again, that's another part of why, right? And it's another part of why being named, being visible in legislation is so critical, because if you don't see yourself in the conversation, then the violence must not be happening to you. It must be something that you individually are dealing with, right? It's a very isolating concept. And the more we can sort of talk about domestic and sexual violence as it affects all people, the more likely we are to see survivors come forward and say, this is the support that I need.
And what a great resource AVP offers, because it's not just gay men also who are the victims of violence.
Absolutely.
Right? So.
And I mean, one of the great things about this act is that it's working with organizations like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, it's Legal Aid, it's inMotion, it's anti-human trafficking organizations. I've represented in the past under VAWA child victims of incest. It really is a wide swath of crime victims and victims of intimate partner and family violence across the United States.
So let's give just a quick plug to the different organizations here, because I think you guys provide some very valuable services. If folks want to get involved or reach out to you, where do they go? Is there a website, or a call-in number, a hotline that they can call into?
Our website is www.inmotiononline.org, all one word. You can access us at the Family Justice Centers in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. We also have a intake line on Thursdays from 10 to 2, and the number is 212-695-3800.
And open for any and all women who are
experiencing who have legal questions. We offer
not only victims of domestic violence.
Right. All women.
Any questions? Call in. What's the number again?
212-695-3800.
Great. And then for AVP, how do folks get in touch with you, and what are some of the services that you provide?
We run a 24-hour bilingual English-Spanish hotline, which is 212-714-1141. Also, we're in 8 different locations throughout the city where people can walk in and talk to a counselor advocate, and those locations are online on our website at www.avp.org. And basically we provide direct services, crisis intervention, safety planning, accompaniment, counseling, all of those kinds of things, as well as support groups and opportunities to get involved in the conversation around how we end violence through our community organizing and public advocacy work.
Great. Well, Sharon, Carmen, and Susanna, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for all the work that you do. We're going to take a short break. We have some callers. We'll get back to you in the next segment. And listen in here on Yetta Kurland Live. We'll be right back with you.
I'm always proud to be a New Yorker.
WWRL, sharing and celebrating the LGBT community's ideas, energy, and accomplishments.
But tonight, I am especially proud to be a New Yorker.
We are back here on Yetta Kurland Live. You're listening live, WWRL 1600, Equality Pride Radio. Our next guest is Catherine Abate. Catherine Abate is the president and CEO of Community Healthcare Network. It's a network of clinics and staff that provide quality, culturally competent, and comprehensive community-based primary care, mental health care, and social services for diverse populations in underserved communities throughout New York City. Prior to working with Community Healthcare Network, Abate was New York State Senator from the west side of Manhattan. They've recently come out with a study on the public health impacts of social networking applications like Grindr. I'm honored and delighted that it brings her on to our show tonight here on Yetta Kurland Live. If you've got questions or comments, please call in at 212-868-0975. Again, that number is 212-868-0975. Catherine, welcome to Yetta Kurland Live.
Hi, Yetta. It's my pleasure to be on your show.
Great. Well, good. Well, yeah. You've been doing a lot of work lately.
Yes, we have.
How long has Community Healthcare Network been around? And maybe tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. We've been in existence since 1981, and we've evolved through the years where we've provided family planning and reproductive health care to women in the poorest and most underserved communities. Mm-hmm. And over time, we not only met their needs, in fact, we were providing the first HIV care to women in the city. And so over time, those services expanded to their families, mm-hmm. their partners. So now we do comprehensive primary care to everyone in the community, men, women, children, and no one gets turned away.
In fact, you have a transgender program as well, I believe. Is that
correct? We have, yes. Not only do we have a very large HIV program, which is medical and supportive services, but also a large transgender program, and we're very proud of the work we do in supporting that community. And that program is located in the Bronx and Queens. Mm-hmm. And very much needed.
Very important, yeah.
Community so isolated.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so just we're going to talk a little bit about a recent study that you did around, I guess, social apps like Grindr, Manhunt, and other types of applications. Tell us a little bit what precipitated that study, what were your thoughts about it, and, why did you decide to focus on that?
Sure. I want to give credit to the authors. Mm-hmm. Two members of Community Healthcare Network, Dr. Freddie Milano, who is the VP of HIV programs, and Renata Baruco, who runs their transgender programs. And they, as well as all of us, not just the Community Healthcare Network, are really alarmed while the rates are going down in the country around new HIV infections. There's one population, men having sex with men of the age of 13 to 29, where there's a dramatic increase. And this is according to CDC studies in 2011. And we wanted to better understand what's happening in that population, mm-hmm. and we're serving them. They're coming through our doors. And we know that there's new technology, right. particularly young men are using, and we wanted to see the connection between infection and the technology, and are the messages and prevention we're using effective. And that's why we did this study called 0 Feet Away. It's a perspective on HIV/AIDS and unprotected sex, and men having sex with men using these location-based mobile apps. And it's remarkable. Now, it's not just men who are using these social apps. Mm-hmm. There are women, too. So what I'm saying, really, these prevention messages apply not just to men, but also women, because the incidence of AIDS and HIV is also rising among heterosexual women.
It's interesting, and you like you said, you had some striking numbers. There's been a 45% increase in HIV in men who have sex with men from the age of 13 to 29 between the years of 2006 and 2009. That seems like a real crisis. But do you? I mean, it's like which comes first? Just to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, and maybe is it the technology that's making that happen, or is it that people who would be at risk happen to be using the technology?
Well, no, it's certainly not the technology because, in fact, a lot of these sites are providing prevention messages and very
That's a great point.
Messages
right.
about engaging in safe sex and using condoms. So it's not, you can't say that technology is the cause. And there are 54% of the people that we surveyed are using safe sex. It's what's the alarming part is the 40% who are not.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found, which was so surprising, is they understood about HIV and AIDS. They knew the causes. They knew it was a serious health issue.
Right.
They were afraid of getting infected or reinfected, and still they were participating in unprotected and unsafe sex.
Yeah,
so we have to ask why. What's going on here?
Well, let me ask you, as a healthcare professional, someone with expertise, what do you think is going on there, and what do you propose to combat what I think we would all call a crisis?
It's pretty complicated. Their initial response is, well, sex is just not the same. It's just not as good when you use a condom.
Mm-hmm.
And that sometimes it's impulsive sexual behavior,
mm-hmm.
passion, drugs, alcohol, whatever that goes into that heated moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a much stronger underlying issue. There's a disconnect between the knowledge many of these young men have and the behavior they demonstrate. Many, and we know it through our patients that walk through our door,
mm-hmm.
many of these individuals never saw the face of AIDS, not the way
right.
many of us did in
right.
the 80s and early 90s. They don't even know someone who has been infected or has died, in fact. So
well, they may know somebody who's infected, but they don't see it manifest and probably aren't aware of people.
Right,
right.
Or some people that come through their doors. I'm talking about patients, but let's say people that are applying to
mm-hmm.
work in the field haven't actually met someone
mm-hmm.
with the disease. And so they think this is something, well, it's manageable, you take a pill a day, it's just another chronic disease. So there's a disconnect between the knowledge they have and the kind of behavior, and it's like the heart and the head aren't aligned together.
Yeah.
And so we have to really we have to do a better job of aligning where they are, the technology they're using, and just refocus the prevention messages to do a much better job.
Well, what I think is so innovative and so intelligent about what you're doing is that rather than villainizing the individuals or the applications or the technology, you're thinking really creatively and intelligently about using it as a venue to educate and to encourage safe sex, so that the very programs, the applications which offer advertising or, like you said, outreach on health and planning, it can be used and employed to help motivate, educate people, and make it kind of cool and acceptable and commonly accepted that they use safe sex. So that sounds like just such a smart strategy. And in essence, that's what you guys are going to be employing as a result of the study, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no way that anyone wants to get infected. It's really about education and refocusing their knowledge in a way that protects themselves. It's all about keeping people healthy and safe.
It's just very smart, and also like making it acceptable, making it cool, making it something that everybody knows about and is aware of, as they're using their Grindr or whatever applications that they're using. So
and the other thing that we are doing, and it's not a one-all-fits-all approach, is using treatment also as prevention.
Mm-hmm.
There are individuals that come in, are HIV positive. Their viral loads and CD4 counts may not warrant treatment immediately. It may be coming over of a shorter period of time, but in appropriate cases, when you start that individual on medication sooner, that in fact protects their partners.
Yeah.
And reduces the risk of transmitting the virus by almost 96%. Again, it's only appropriate and with certain individuals, but it's a tremendous prevention tool.
That's great. You've been listening to West Side's own Catherine Abate here on WWRL 1600 Community Healthcare Network. Where can folks go to learn more about the work that you're doing? www.chnnyc.org. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk to us.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night, and thank you for your work.
Okay, bye.
Yep, bye-bye. All right, we're going to turn our attention backwards for a little bit. We have on this side of the microphone with us our producer, Mr. Paul Newell, who's going to talk along with Morgan Pehme. Morgan is a contributing person here. He's editor-in-chief at City and State New York, a regular guest on Yetta Kurland Live, and deeply knowledgeable about New York politics. City and State recently published their 2012 Year in Review, and as always, I'm delighted to have Morgan here on Yetta Kurland Live. Morgan, thanks for taking some time to come on the show and talk to us.
Thanks for having me back, Yetta.
Sure. So let's start with a little 2013 news. What's your take on the governor's State of the State address today?
Well, it was a very robust speech today. At the end of the speech, the governor kind of recapped all the initiatives he had announced, and there were so many. It was like watching the scroll of movie credits.
It was amazing. Yeah.
Big Hollywood feature. So it was very ambitious. I felt like it was a national speech. I mean,
big plug for women, gun control, these types of national issues.
Yes, and
as well as workers' rights and minimum wage, which I thought was a step for him.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, minimum wage was one of the speaker's main agendas for last year that was scuttled and didn't get through, but. It was just, it seemed very presidential, national in scope, and that, the governor was trying to make an impact beyond the borders of New York City and New York State. So it was very ambitious, and, it's looking back at everything that he had outlined. I mean, there were very few areas other than hydrofracking and healthcare that he didn't touch upon. So, this is going to be a very ambitious year for him.
Yeah, I mean, but I will say, like, no discussion of fracking, isn't that almost kind of a win? I'm not, I mean, obviously, folks who are strong fracking advocates, as I am, want to see him take a stronger stance against fracking. But I feel like the governor's been getting a lot of focus, and he's been not as aggressive in terms of fracking as a lot of other governors in a lot of other states have been.
I think he's clearly moved in the last 6 months on the issue, and I think that storm maybe had a lot to do with that.
Huh. More.
I mean, it's interesting because there were over 1,500 anti-fracking activists outside of the convention center where the governor gave a speech today, and Deborah Winger was there, and Pete Seeger, and Natalie Merchant, and if you were walking into the speech, you would think that it was going to be all about hydrofracking, and so the governor not touching upon it, I'm hesitant to construe what that means. Whether it means that, he just didn't want to fight that battle today and antagonize all the anti-fracking people. Certainly they were disheartened by that leaked memo that the New York Times wrote about last week.
Right.
The Cuomo administration dismissed it as a year ago, but essentially what that memo said was that hydrofracking didn't necessarily have negative health consequences. And so I think there was a lot of ambivalence about that, and so it's kind of up in the air that the governor hasn't touched upon it. But at least for the anti-fracking advocates, they saw that as a must for the governor to completely impose a moratorium on fracking in order for him to be, in their eyes, a plausible presidential candidate in 2016.
I have another question that I'd like to run by you regarding this speech. You said he framed it. You thought it was framed really as a presidential speech, reaching out to whoever it was, Iowa caucus voters. But I was wondering. I think on the local level, with the litany of issues, I feel like a lot of it was cleared through Jeff Klein and this independent Democratic caucus that is supposedly running the Senate in part, and that the list of items chosen were sort of what would be palatable to this constructed majority in the Senate. I was wondering.
It's a great question.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Paul. And I think that the governor's office sees this divided Senate between the Republicans and the Democrats as an area in which they can maneuver. That a lot of the kind of big ticket progressive agenda items that they were stymied on in the first 2 years of the administration, they feel that now there's an opening because of this division in the Senate, because both Senator Skelos and Senator Klein, they have very little wiggle room. And so the Cuomo administration believes that they can exploit that in order to, execute some of these more progressive items on their wish list.
So you think that this caucus is still weighing strongly in terms of the balance of powers in Albany?
Well, they had their first Senate session today. They announced the rules. I mean, it is moving forward. Both Senators Klein and Senator Skelos were on stage with Governor Cuomo today.
Yeah.
Everyone's kind of waiting to see how this goes. I mean, it could be a tremendous success and be a model for coalition governance that we have. It's not unlike some of the systems we see in around the world, like in Israel or in England.
Yeah.
We could have this parliamentary form of government, or it could go to hell in a handbasket. And just be the usual dysfunction and calamitous situation that we're used to seeing in Albany. So, I think that, there's both optimism and skepticism, and no one knows how it's going to play out.
It's a good way to start kind of looking forward for 2013. Now let's look back a little bit. What do you think in terms of at least what New York State and City thought? What was kind of the biggest story of 2012?
Well, I think your listeners know the two biggest stories of last year. One, of course, was Hurricane Sandy. That was one of the worst natural disasters that our state and in a lot of ways our country has ever suffered. We're still, that was a big part of Governor Cuomo's speech today, saying that $9 billion that Congress has already approved for us is inadequate. He really took Congress to task and said that other $51 billion had to come through for us. And then the other big story of last year was the election. Most of us were focused on the presidential election, but as we were just talking about the dynamic in the state Senate, that's an outgrowth of last year's elections. We had some really contentious congressional elections. Senator Gillibrand was reelected. We elected the first openly gay and Asian American members of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the two overarching stories of the year, the election really through November, and then from October on with Sandy.
How do you think the Sandy superstorm impacts politics in Albany or City Hall, and how do you think that'll impact in 2013? Will it be pretty much forgotten? Is it something where we're going to see like a lot of focus on the rebuilding and the fight to get monies onto the ground? How do you think that impacts either Albany or City Hall?
Well, so far the villain in this affair has been Congress in D.C., particularly the Republican majority in the House, and so no one has had to turn on each other in New York. It's been an issue that people can unify behind. I've seen a lot of really encouraging bipartisanship from members of the legislature, members of Congress. The congressional delegation that went to D.C., led by Congressmember King and Congresswoman Nita Lowey, and that was a true bipartisan undertaking. And so, everyone was affected by the storm, rich and poor, all across our city. And
even Chris Christie kind of became a hero for a second or two there, right?
Not just for a second. Chris Christie is, I think I saw the poll numbers this morning, he's polling 72, 73%.
Wow.
Polling high with Democrats. He's polling high with so many of the traditional demographics that would be challenging for a Republican governor to make headway with, but he really established his credibility and his willingness to fight for New Jerseyans and New Yorkers.
Sure.
So,
sure, but I mean, I think you're right that it's easy for a lot of us right now to blame the Republican Congress because wow, are they blameworthy? But
and completely dropped the ball at the end of the year. I mean, that was, I think, with the jaw dropper that opened that up
in an outrageous criminal way, in the way that we just discussed in the previous segment. But I do think that or at least I'd like to hear your thoughts on, as we move forward and start thinking longer term about this, there was a huge push in the last 12 years towards developing the city's waterfront, and I'm wondering if people are going to be held to account for that, or if people are going to rethink that kind of strategy. And do you see that taking a significant role in mayoral elections, what have you?
Certainly it's going to be a big role, play a big role in the mayoral race. Every mayoral candidate will have to stake out their position there, and our readiness, our preparedness for the future will be critical. Governor Cuomo was very clear today that he believes in climate change. He showed an incredible graphic of what New York City looked like back in the 1600s.
On a day that the temperature rose to 53 degrees in point.
Right, and basically what he was demonstrating was that, over half of Lower Manhattan was man-made and built out artificially. Yeah. And those were the areas that really were deluged in the storm. And one of the initiatives that Governor Cuomo talked about today was basically a buyback program for people who didn't think that it was feasible to rebuild in their neighborhoods and wanted to essentially abandon their homes and take the money and go settle somewhere else. And he didn't talk about how this would be financed, but he did say that he would like to have money aside so that we're not necessarily going to resettle in every area. And I thought that was interesting because Assemblywoman Malliotakis at an event that City and State held a couple weeks ago was saying that a lot of her constituents in Staten Island, they actually don't want to go back.
Yeah. The devil's in the details in this. You hit it spot on when you said how this is going to be funded, right? In a city where real estate is to New York as oil is to Texas, the real issue here, people were using terms like disaster capitalism or whatnot, but even just simply how that all happens is I think an important point.
And what Paul was saying was a great point in that, a lot of people have faulted the mayor, saying that it was irresponsible for us to be so gung-ho about building up the waterfront, and that it looks great, and it spurs development, but what, we knew that the waters were rising and this could possibly be perilous. And so that's something that we're going to have to take a hard look at, and unfortunately that's not something that necessarily dovetails with political considerations. Just the idea of saying, maybe we can't rebuild this neighborhood. That's a very hard sell.
It's a hard thing to
explain
or to explain to people who have lived there for years and years. Let's try to squeeze in. We're going to try to squeeze in at least one more caller before we end the segment. I'm going to go to Thomas from Chelsea. Thomas, you're on the air. Welcome to Yetta Kurland Live.
Hello, Yetta. I just want to make a point that I think would be very helpful for liberals, progressives, and Democrats in the next 2 years, and that's that there was a situation in this election which has been commented on, but not to my satisfaction. According to the Cook Political Report, for only the second time in 70 years did the party whose candidates got the most votes did not win control of the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. The Democratic candidates got more than 1 million votes than the Republican candidates, but as you know, because of a very skillful gerrymandering, the Republicans retained control. And, of course, Boehner was the speaker.
Right.
So I think that all of the liberals and progressives who have a public outlet, like a radio show or a TV show.
Where would we ever find one of those, Tom?
The House of Unrepresentatives. It is the House of Unrepresentatives. They are not a representative body. They are an unrepresentative body.
It's an excellent
everybody
point.
Should be told that, and hopefully we can shame these people into representing the majority instead of the gerrymandered minority.
Great. Well, it's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks for calling in. And actually, I will wrap up this final question to Morgan and Paul, if you want to comment. I think it's a point, and I think our guests from an earlier segment commented on some of the gridlock in the Congress in the past. What do you predict for 2013? Are we going to get a little bit better at that? Is there going to be some forward momentum, or what do you think?
I think that President Obama is going to take a different strategy working with Congress than he has in the past. I think we already saw that with the fiscal cliff. But what your caller was saying is absolutely right. Because of gerrymandered districts, we don't have the kind of middle ground districts that we historically had in this country. They're so partisanly divided that you have ideologues on both sides, and so there's no reason within the districts for candidates to take a moderate stance.
On both sides, but especially on the Republican side.
I mean, in fairness, on both sides. And so, the willingness to compromise is low, and the Republicans, made it very clear in President Obama's first term that they would be the party of no, and they would just try to block his agenda. And, although there was a willingness to deal with the fiscal cliff, the 11th hour, I think that especially with another election cycle coming up, that you're going to see more resistance to the president, and unfortunately, probably not a great deal is going to get done. But I'm hopeful for the country. I never want to see dysfunction of any type in our government. Unfortunately, it's just far too common.
Good point to end on. We'll look forward to your commentary along the way in 2013. Thanks for coming on the show tonight, Morgan.
Thanks. I hope your listeners will check out cityandstateny.com and sign up for our first read email.
cityandstateny.com. You're listening to Yetta Kurland Live.
Thank you, Yetta.
Thanks, Yetta. Happy New Year.
The preceding program was independently produced. The views and opinions expressed were those of the program host and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of WWRL, its staff, or management.